You're listening to KRFP Moscow. It is 3:03. This is Peace Radio. We are going to have do a few minutes of headlines briefly, and then our guest.
Our guest, Dr. Ellison. He's the chairman of political science and philosophy at U of Idaho.
Those are our headlines for this hour, and now a discussion of the Electoral College.
Okay. So thank you for coming in on short notice, Dr. Ellison.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I just sent a random email to the department because every election cycle I think about the Electoral College, and then of course I forget about it for 4 years like everybody else. I think I only learned about it in 11th grade. Isn't that when we have to take government?
Probably, yes.
Probably, back in Iowa. So could you set us up with like the background of how we got here? You're on the local government, you're in political science. I assume you can't not know about the Electoral College.
I do. I actually I know a lot about the Electoral College. One of my field is intergovernmental relations, which is just federalism, and I've been working doggedly on a book, not doggedly because it's been a decade probably, on federalism, and the Electoral College is often held up as a feature of federalism, and it is to a certain extent. And when we teach it in the schools, we teach it in high schools, we teach that it's one way to protect the states, especially small states, from large states in the selection of the president. This is a very complex story. I don't know how much of the complexity you want me to get at, but the purpose of the Electoral College is to select candidates for the presidency. The founders made a mistake, and the mistake was they didn't foresee the advent of political parties. So they created this mechanism to select people who would then be chosen to be president. The top three Electoral College vote getters in the Constitution, as we understood it originally, would then be candidates for the presidency, and the House of Representatives would select the president. Because of democratic impulses and the power of some democratic ideas, however, they manipulated the Constitution. So when the House of Representatives sets for the purpose of selecting the president, it's one state, one vote. So if the House of Representatives was choosing the president, California would get one vote and Wyoming would get one vote. That begs the question of why did they do it? What our textbooks tell us is they did it because the founders were not really Democrats. In other words, they really didn't believe in direct democracy, and they didn't want to have a person that was selected by the people who understood themselves to be the leader of the United States, of citizens of the United States. The purpose of the House of Representatives is to provide representation to the United States. But the reason they created the Electoral College was to protect slavery. It's a vestige of slavery. Why did they need the Electoral College to protect slavery? Might be the next question. Well, the reason, the issue at the founding, just like the issue up until the Civil War, was that most people lived in the North. So by the time we get to the Civil War, for example, we have 20 million Americans living in the northern states and 4 million people living in the southern states. That proportion wasn't the same. There were only 4 million people in the United States when we became a country. But the idea was the same. So, for example, we get the 3/5 compromise, right? The only way southern states could have adequate representation, according to them, in the House of Representatives was to be able to count their slaves, right? The same was true in the presidential election. If it was a democratically selected president, and the southern states could not count their slaves as 3/5 of a person, they would never participate in American politics. The first 8 presidents were from the largest state, Virginia. That democratic impulse still mattered at that time. That's ultimately why we would have the Civil War, too.
So was the Electoral College in force on our first election? When did it come in?
Yes, our first election was the election of President George Washington, and it began to have problems fairly quickly because we began to fragment into political parties. So the idea there was that George Washington was such a powerful figure, so honored, so respected, and so opposed to forming political factions, political parties in particular, that he appointed to his first cabinet Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, who were the rivals, political rivals in the founding of the United States. Thomas Jefferson left that cabinet after one term and effectively formed the country's first political party. It was the Republican Party, or called the Republican Democrats or Democratic Republicans, depending on which history book you read. The name of that party was changed to firmly to the Democratic Party by Andrew Jackson in 1828, but founded a political party. So you have the Federalists, right, who are a collection of people under Alexander Hamilton just kind of because they were pro-United States of America. Then you have what were the Anti-Federalists, thinking maybe we should lose that Anti-Federalist label. So that creates the first problem, right? And under the original Constitution, same Constitution, as we understood the Constitution, right? The House of Representatives would choose the president. Whoever got the most votes in the House of Representatives became president, and whoever got the second most votes in the House of Representatives became vice president. So the president's most effective rival under the founders' conception would be the president of the Senate.
I wondered why that
So
happened.
if we were managing according to this original idea, right, Hillary Clinton would now be president of the Senate. And that's a really critical feature of checks and balances. And we learned that very quickly, right, when Thomas Jefferson won and Aaron Burr was his vice president, and that was his most effective political rival. That didn't work very well. So the idea of running as a ticket, running two people, right, instead of one person, quickly emerged. Then we adjusted the Constitution to make that possible.
So can we adjust the Constitution to get rid of the Electoral College, or should we not? Is there any benefit to it right now?
Well,
I've stumped him.
no, I'm not stumped in the least bit. I'm trying to think of how I can parsimoniously explain that, answer that. So here's the situation we have in the United States right now. The first answer is yes, we can change the Electoral College. We can get rid of it if we want to. I'd take an amendment to the Constitution, and I can tell you why that's almost impossible.
Yeah,
but why we should do that. Well, the argument right now, of course, is that we shouldn't do that because if we got rid of the Electoral College, then there would be no reason for presidents to visit Idaho or presidential candidates to visit Wyoming, to visit rural small states, right? They are part of the equation at this point. This is a fiction, by the way, but they're part of this equation. Instead, people would campaign in the large cities in California and New York State, et cetera, where the people actually are, right? I mean, it's the variable. So the United States of America has become a nation of metropolitan. Right now, the top 100 metropolitan areas of U.S. GDP, 90% of all employment of people with advanced degrees. These are different kind of population centers who, under this Constitution right now, have relatively not represented strength that they actually. Hillary Clinton is winning the population. So we absolutely should eliminate the Electoral College because we're not allowing people to actually be represented in this election of the president. If you believe in that, if you believe that people should have representations, then
I didn't vote for Trump, but it meant I didn't.
Well, that's a reason. If we Electoral College your vote within states, so for example, Maine did that. Southern states that are now trying to suppress the vote would be trying to increase the ability of people to participate, because getting people out to vote would matter so much more than suppressing the vote matters today. And amazing change, and that's something we should do. The obstacles to that, of course, are to amend the Constitution. You need 36, and that would mean, and this is another problem Americans have, of course. We pretend like we have a national election. We do not have a national election. There is no United States of America election. Madison wanted at least an election for members of the House of Representatives controlled by the U.S. Didn't get that. James Wilson wanted a popular election for president. Didn't get that. We have 50 elections for president on the same day. It means in order to change the Constitution, Alabama would have to say, we're willing to surrender this power to the United States. Mississippi would say, we're willing to surrender this power to the United States. Idaho would have to say this. And in particular, that gigantic red block that sits in the middle of the United States are the states that would have something to lose. And what do they have to lose? They have overrepresentation, right? They have more representation than they should have based upon population, especially when you put them together as a collection. I mean, it is an absolutely interesting phenomena that if you drew a circle around California, included Idaho and Oregon, right? California is about the 6th, 8th largest economy in the world. And then drew a little, probably a 200-mile circle, but maybe even a 100-mile circle around New York City. You probably are accounting for 80% of U.S. GDP, which means we're accounting for probably 80% of U.S. productivity, right? And those areas have remarkably little, by virtue of their relative size, and that is they're huge, representation.
So you're saying they have less representation proportional to like
Much
me
less.
in North
Much less. It's as simple as California has 2 senators and Wyoming has 2 senators, right? I mean, it's that simple.
But they have a bunch of representatives, huh?
They do.
California does.
That's correct.
Yes. And I'm from Iowa. I do understand overrepresentation of tiny rural states because you got to have that first primary or caucus. That's what we have. So, yeah, we see way too much there of the candidates. So maybe I am biased towards let them hang out in L.A. Just get off my lawn. But I would think now with social media, regular media, local media, and Twitter, all of that stuff, do we really need the candidates in our face anymore? Do we worry about if they come to Idaho? I didn't see any at my doorstep.
Yeah.
I mean, you said that's
I am, as a political scientist, I feel like my field has been completely decimated. So I don't know what to believe or to think anymore. I didn't know how to speak to my students on Wednesday morning. I don't know what to say
Fortunately, I didn't have to speak to
because all of the things we think we know just got thrown out the window. So how we understand public opinion, how we measure public opinion, how we understand the impact of social media is yet to be explored. Absolutely.
It will be interesting times. Exciting. So the Electoral College, back to that, it's been in since the beginning. It splits the votes roughly by population because California gets a bunch, right? So my perception as a layperson is not that it gives Idaho more power, just that it coalesces it into smaller numbers instead of California having a bazillion people versus our, 3 million, whatever it is in Idaho. Then they have X number of electoral votes and we have hardly any. So is it really a material difference in power? You say I'm overrepresented and they're under?
Well, if the election was held between Idaho and California, then everything would be fine. Right? I mean, if we understood that. But, when I'm talking about these metro areas, for example, metropolitan areas are all highly fragmented. Many of them are fragmented by states. They're organized by state constitutions and state legislatures. So it's very difficult for these real population centers to have, a voice, a structural voice. If there's a reason to rewrite the Constitution, it's because we've changed so fundamentally as a society. Yeah, if it was between Idaho and California, everything would be fine. But
it's all those other people. No.
Yes.
It's so you're saying it's really those concentrated population centers that are the issue.
I'm saying that the concentrated population centers don't have adequate representation in the national government.
Okay. Interesting, because those of us who live in the rural area often feel differently. In Iowa, I knew we were overrepresented. I don't know how you could feel that way because the House of Representatives and now the Senate even more so fundamentally reflects rural voters and rural ideas much more than urban and that is true with the
populist
conservative
ideas.
Liberal bit. And, that is true.
I mean, we're about to defund sanctuary cities, for example. I mean, I wouldn't know how we can do that. This is another...
Sorry, we're going to what?
Defund sanctuary cities. That's what...
Well, that was the threat,
Yeah, I'm not sure how you do that, but... which is most of the things. I'm not sure how you do it, but I'm...
and most things don't get done.
Yes.
So,
there's that gigantic... I don't know how you elect Trump at the end of that moment, right?
Right.
So I was responding to collections of people about, policy prescriptions, and one of the narratives that's now emerging from this election, we're leaving the Electoral College kind of, but is that I voted for Trump, but I don't feel this way, which is an extremely, extremely difficult sociology and psychology
me of the Brexit
to approach.
In Europe, or in the UK, where people voted for Brexit without really thinking about, they thought nobody else was going to do that. Like it was an out there vote to cast, and now we have the British exit from the EU.
Could be. I hope so.
And then
I hope people are regretful.
I don't know. I don't know. Confused, which I think was true in England and in the UK in general.
What about this idea of the faithless electors.
The faithless electors, you're off mic.
The idea of the faithless electors.
Well, the idea of the faceless electors is technically possible, right? So technically, yes, we have these people called electors, and in 23 states, those electors are bound to the popular vote. But technically, yes, the electors could vote differently in the other states than their populations told them to do. And so, yes, it's technically possible.
When is the last time that happened, that an elector voted against the state?
Oh, I think it happens all the time, but
Really?
we had an elector in Washington State. This election, it was saying there was, no matter how the election went, he was not voting for Hillary Clinton as an elector from Washington State, as a liberal Democrat, because he thinks that that we shouldn't have been there. So it happens all the time, but enough of it to happen that it would change the electoral outcome is a really interesting question.
And how does one get to be an elector? Huh? How do you get to be that guy?
Different mechanisms, but state legislatures choose people to be electors, and people who are largely nobody politically, right? So they're not members of their House or their Senate or have a political pedigree so much, but just people who got this connection of some kind that made them electors.
So they're just random citizens, or are they?
It's a little more than random citizens, but they're not political operatives, so to speak, in most states. In some states, they don't even actually have, I don't know how many, but they're not actual individuals, right? Because they've written laws that say the popular vote gets tied to Electoral College vote.
So nobody even gets a free trip to D.C.? Bummer.
I think those electoral votes are submitted to the House of Representatives. Yes, probably electronically or by mail or something today. They used to actually open the Electoral College votes in the House, and maybe there are some electors there.
So you also mentioned that Maine, and for people who were looking at the map that night, there was, the bars that said the split. Are more states thinking about that, or how does that work for Maine and that idea of the splitting up, not winner take all, but divvying it
they didn't exactly do a proportional. They didn't do a proportional representation in their Electoral College votes, but they created a system of weighted averaging votes. So when you go into that booth, instead of voting just for Trump or just for Hillary Clinton, you would rank order. You rank order now in Maine all of the candidates.
Okay.
And then that produces a system in which they eliminate all the fives, and then and they eliminate so that they build consensus in this process. They eliminate all the fives and move those votes to one. It's a sort of an odd system to generate. Well, yeah, they're in charge of their electoral system, to generate a 50% plus one result.
Okay.
And they did that because they've had a number of elections, in particular the gubernatorial elections, in which plurality is selecting representatives.
Like somebody would get 36% of the vote, but that would be a higher percentage than anybody else got?
Yes, like their current governor, and he's a bit of a crazy person, was elected with 38% of the vote.
And we don't do runoffs like other countries that have these systems, or you keep running it off until somebody gets more.
Well, we do that, right? So in like urban elections, mayors, for example, we often have runoffs because you have to get for 50 plus 1% of the vote. So this is a system to generate a 50% plus one without having to go and run off and run off and run off. I'll have to study it a little more. It's just like 15 seconds I looked at it.
Yeah. It's more than me. So how would the Electoral College work if we let go of this idea that the two-party system is somehow a thing that America requires? I hear people in my family and others say that, but we have two parties and that's required. I'm like, it's not.
Well, two-party system is an inevitable result of the structure of our government. Okay. If you have a 50% plus one requirement, in other words, someone has to win a majority of the votes, and you have single-member districts, and there's going to be no logical reason to form third parties. If you live for example, Bulgaria just had a presidential election. I think they had 22 candidates, right? So if you allow people to be elected by plurality, and that is whoever gets the most votes, we'd all fall apart immediately, right? I mean, Bernie Sanders people would go one way, the mainstream corporate Democrats would go one way, the far right would go one way, and we would have a number of different political parties, just by structure.
Okay. So it tends to regenerate itself.
Yeah, we can change our structure. We could simply have a couple of things. One was we could allow victory by plurality, and we could have multiple member districts. So instead of having one person represent District 1 in Idaho, we could have two people represent District 1 in Idaho, and we could say whoever gets the most votes gets to be represented. And I think you'd see, like in some countries like Bulgaria, you have to get 5%. You got to get past a certain post 5%, but there are people in their legislature with 7% of the vote, right? So you might see such fragmentation that, our two representatives had received 10% of the vote each, and that's where that coalition building in a parliamentary system becomes critical.
And not something we have any practice at. So.
We have no practice at this, no.
Yeah. We don't seem to be doing that well with the two-party either.
We have an ancient system. I tell my students that, and it blows. I ask them what is the oldest government in the world, and they'll say China or something like that. But it's the United States of America, and we're ancient. A 240 plus year system of government. To use a constitution that was written in 1789 by. Let's go and say they were wonderful, brilliant guys. They were actually fairly amazing people.
Some of them are my ancestors.
But it's still a pre-modern document written by pre-modern people with pre-modern minds, and it really needs some reform.
So if you were to look around the world and pick a process that worked, what are some of the better ways of choosing a president that are actually being used?
Or a leader, even if the name has to change.
Yeah.
Well, it depends on your standards, right? I mean, I've actually lived all over the world. I lived in Russia. I lived in Russia in 2004 when Putin was being selected, and it was interesting. The only way you'd know there's an election going on in Russia is to read the American media, because there was no evidence of it whatsoever there. So there you have a very efficient system for authoritatively choosing who's going to be in charge. But if you want to have a more democratic process, Great Britain is probably the most democratic nation in the world. Where you have election, and even more than just empowering citizens to choose their representatives, but also you have you don't have private money in public elections. They're held at 30 days before an event. A new election can be called when people lose faith in the governments. You have an amazingly democratic process there, more or less.
A bit ironic, but good for them. And how long have they maintained that?
Well, it's a bit of an evolution for Great Britain. So people could always say, yes, Great Britain has an older government, but they've had some very substantial changes in their system of governance since the mid-1800s that have evolved into, right? So there's no such thing as a citizen of Great Britain. There's no such thing as a constitution of Great Britain. These are a series of traditions that have created a system in which the House of Representatives, the House of Commons there, right, governs. The House of Representatives is in charge. So if you have what is in our government, the only democratic institution in American government is the House of Representatives. If you let that democratic institution run things, then through evolution, kind of push the Senate aside, push the president, the executive aside, right? Evolve a judiciary. They've evolved a judiciary. The idea that panels of unelected lawyers can overturn the decisions of duly elected representatives of the people is a uniquely sort of American democratic practice. Then you have a more purely democratic system. But the problem, it's a deeper problem than that, right? I mean, it's not only that our institutions are flawed, but our systems of civic education are woefully inadequate in this country. We don't have, this is empirically verifiable. There's books and books and books and books that, our citizens cannot identify or understand even basic processes of governance in this country. That's probably the foundation of our problem.
So how do we fix that?
Well, it's a long ways from the Electoral College, but the advent of universal public education in this country, right? Thomas Jefferson dreamed of universal public education. We didn't actually get it until we were kind of past the midpoint of the American Industrial Revolution, and I do that in my own way from post-Civil War into the 1920s. So circa 1900, when a vast plurality of people living in the United States, as much as 40% were not born in the United States. That's when we finally sat down and said, and because we had to support industrialization, right, which means teaching young people the discipline of the clock and all of those kinds of things. We finally sat down and said, okay, let's take these vast masses, set them down in one place, teach them one story about who we are as citizens of the United States, what's the story of the country, and what it means to be an American, which is a really interesting political act, right? What's even more interesting is we continue to do that. So it's only been very recently that states have begun to purge some of the crazier stuff from their civics education textbooks. Really tell the story of Native Americans, really tell the story of how we treat minorities, really tell the story of these evolutions in our country. And it's threatening to our people, threatening to young people in particular, but we can talk about the evolution of morality, public morality in this country, which actually does take place, right? We start at one spot, but we slowly but surely, and in some cases, for example, with same-sex marriage issues, for example, which in 2000 that was introduced on the national stage, and by 2015-16 we get these amazing changes. So even the rate of this evolution can proceed. It's offensive to young people when we say, we actually did do really bad things to Native Americans. Or, for example, when I'm dealing with my students, when we're having that standoff in Oklahoma and the Bundy people, which, this is just kind of beyond nuts sort of argumentation that because we're ranchers, we get all of the federal land. People are kind of going with it, yes. But, if we're going to return that to the people who actually own it, it's called the Native Americans. And this crazy understanding of who we are, crazy, and I'm sorry to use the word crazy, but I think I can back it up. Stories that aren't true about who we are, how we evolved, how we understand ourselves. If we could fix some of that, I think we'd go a long ways towards fixing our political institutions.
Cool. Yeah, I heard that actually from a Crow guy at the Custer Battlefield, which we now call the Battle of the Greasy Grass, which is not where it was. But anyway, he was a Crow guide there, and of course they were on Custer's side, and he said that he thought most of American education was patriotism, not history.
Of course, that's true.
And I taught Native American studies in Iowa as a white chick, diversity hire, not. But I had several students accuse me of being a self-hating white person for telling them some of the actual history. Like, beside the point, this is the history, no matter what you think.
Well, we do that systematically, and even in texts, for example, American Political Science, Introduction to American Government textbooks, we water that down. We can't tolerate hitting students over the head with it. And what's even more interesting is we can't even tolerate hitting students over the head with political science.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of ideas about political socialization and how we behave that we placate a little bit so that it's not quite as difficult as it might. And I don't mean difficult because it's a difficult concept, but difficult because it would be create emotional dissonance. Right? I mean...
Yeah, and for all the minority stuff, the immigration things and the identity things, and we skirt around so much. And a lot of our political controversy I found when I was teaching at university, we had to skirt around.
It's worse than that, by the way, but...
I'm being generous, and I don't work there anymore.
Yeah, you're being generous.
I'm not understanding when you say that to teach history, to teach the real history, that it would be offensive to young people.
They get offended.
But that doesn't mean they shouldn't be taught.
No. Not in my mind.
Well, it's not necessarily a problem of being offensive. It's more a problem of the cognitive dissonance that's created and their inability to be analytical in approaching these topics. So much of it, and it's by structure, right?
Right.
So much of it is left. This is an election that proves the point. So much of it is left to emotion and emotional response, and so little is left to analytical ability and analytical responses. So, and there's a guy who won a Nobel Prize, Daniel Kahneman, wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, talks about the use of heuristics, particularly in politics, right? But we overtly create these structures. We have decided, in particular with young people, specifically since the 1960s to depoliticize them. We have taken and altered our institutions with an overt attempt to take them from radical, to remove all the radical impulses in young people. So, for example, if you look at universities today, we've stripped all radical impulses out of universities. In fact, we've done such a good job that if the United States invaded Canada tomorrow, the last people that would notice would be called college students, and the last people that would protest would be called college students. You know, how is that? We made those changes, and there's very specific things that we've done over the course of the last 40, 50 years to do those.
But it does seem that that's breaking down a little bit, or at least with the recent election and with the Black Lives Matter movement, where, I mean, there were a lot of protests on campuses against hate and against Trump.
Yeah, my experience has been different. But I don't see masses of college students, but my experience has been different. So.
College students pose no existential threat to the status quo.
Well, sure.
I mean, the last time they posed an existential threat to the status quo, our federal government conspired to put them in jail. I mean, it was,
Yeah.
Kent State, that kind of era. Yes. Interesting. Not very encouraging, but very interesting. Thank you. So is there any final thought on the Electoral College you want us to know? Do you want us to get out there and,
I think it's going to be an interesting. It's going to be interesting to watch how these numbers grow, and how obvious it's going to become that there's a flaw with the Electoral College. But
we saw it with
data and analysis aren't actually going to work very well here.
Yeah.
So,
and it's even making us question our polls, which I wish we'd done years ago. That who are they calling? You know, getting these wrong answers. That could have to do with cell phones not being listed. Too.
Yeah.
And like I always give out. It's not fraud if I just give out a fake number at the drugstore because I don't care. 867
You just want the discount.
We'll get you the discount at every store. You don't have to give your real one. So I think a lot of it has been also a skewing of how we reach people. But it will be intriguing. And thank you for the insight. I didn't know the Electoral College led to slavery.
Well, no, it was a reflection of slavery.
Reflection of slavery. Studying it leads to slavery. Now I wish we still had our Black History correspondent.
Yeah,
oh well,
yeah,
we'll have to find a new one to elucidate that. Well, thank you for coming in.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. Truly appreciate it.
You speak to our legislators
later today. Yes.
I didn't even know they were in town, but we were invited.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Appreciate the time. Thanks.